Okay, good evening. Thank you for coming here. Thank you for being here. Thank you to those who came at 6:30 to taste the delicious food that Anna and her team have prepared. We said that what is good medicine according to the Bible? Laughter. Laughter is good medicine. And I told you I'm going to tell you a joke, a clean joke. Okay, somebody said there are no clean jokes. There are some clean jokes. Who knows where am I from? I'm from Romania. Okay, so this is a Romanian joke. Now, anybody who knows a little bit about Romania, you know that up to 1989 we had a dictator. His name was Ceausescu, Nicolae Ceausescu. Okay, this joke actually was told by a Romanian guy to the president himself. And he found it quite funny. Other people wanted to take him away, but so the joke is about who is the bravest. Is it a Russian, an American, or who is the bravest? Okay, it's a Romanian joke, right? So here's what happened. It says that Ronald Reagan and Brezhnev, who was the president of Russia, the USSR, and our dictator Ceausescu, they had a meeting in the Black Sea. So the Black Sea is the sea that's there. They were on a boat. They had this summit, and they wanted to see who is the bravest. You know, they were talking about it, and they had a wager. So Brezhnev, the Russian president, he sends Ivan. You know, Ivan is the Russian name. Okay, Ivan, go fetch me 2 sharks. Ivan jumps into the water. You know, he goes and comes back with 2 sharks, but you know, he has a limb missing. His hand is missing, right? Oh, and everybody's impressed. Then Ronald Reagan sends John, you know, John, go get me 4 sharks. John jumps in the water, you know, he goes, swims, you know, comes back with 4 sharks, but he has no arm and he has no leg. And they say, wow, Americans are so brave. Then the Romanian, the dictator, he calls Bula. Okay, Bula, that's the name of all the jokes in Romania with Bula. And he said, hey, Bula, go get me 6 sharks. And Bula goes to the end of the boat. He puts his hand in the water and says, no, that's too cold for me. And everybody agreed that Bula was the bravest because he told no to the dictator, okay? Anyway. The idea is also that, you know, Bula was lazy, right? And he wouldn't even get into the water. But anyway, thank you again for coming here. Remember, we need to enjoy life as much as we can, in spite of circumstances of our lives and in spite of what's happening. You know, even today we find out more and more about Ukraine and all those bad things happening there. Let's pray. And then we can let Anna go ahead with the meeting. Father in heaven, thank you, Lord, for your love for us. Thank you that you are the one who came to this world to serve us. The Bible says that you did not come to be served, but to serve. And that is what we see in the life of Jesus. Thank you also that the way that you created this world, the beautiful Garden of Eden, you put everything in place for Adam and Eve, our first human family, to be able to live a healthful, productive, and joyous life. Lord, thank you that you promised to restore all things to the beauty of Eden and even greater beauty. Be with us now, and I pray that you be with Anna as she talks tonight. Speak to us through her and help us learn and help us apply the things that we learn. This is our prayer. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Thanks for joining us. Today we're talking about inflammatory foods. And it seems like inflammation or actually pain is one of the major symptoms that we all kind of can relate to, right? Pain, we sometimes have backaches or pains that we just don't know where they come from. And it seems to be a driving force to autoimmune diseases or just chronic conditions all throughout. And there have been a lot of people that have been on elimination diets. I don't know if you've heard of those, but they try to eliminate certain things, and they find that that either reduces their pain, their levels of pain, or altogether eliminates the pain. And they can go on with their lives with pain-free, right? So we're going to talk about inflammation, inflammatory foods that may be the source of those pains, along with other things this evening. So when you have inflammation in your body, it can come up in these particular signs. So you might find that you have redness, maybe a little bit of itchiness, swelling, and some pain points, right? Backaches, neck-ache, and then you just don't know where it all comes. So all of these classic signs, it just means that the body is trying to recruit cells to start the process of healing and reparation in the body. So inflammation, as I mentioned, it's involved in all chronic disease, including autoimmune diseases that we're mentioning. It's turned into an epidemic nowadays. So the focus for this night is talking about the 3 R's of healing. So we have remove, replace, and repair. We want to remove all the harmful things that we have going on, inflammatory triggers, the foods that cause inflammation, habits, and we want to replace the harmful with the helpful, right? With things that are beneficial for our body. And we want to repair. We want to help our body repair the digestive system, because who can tell me what percentage is in your gut?
80.
80, very close. 70%, right, of your immune system is in the digestive system. So we're gonna keep on repeating it that way we can remember, but that was pretty close. So repairing the digestive system gives your body the ability to focus on fighting off infections in other parts of the body, and then also starting the repairing process in between. All right, so we're gonna start with sugar. So when you think about high levels of cholesterol and triglycerides, what do you usually think of? What types of food cause that? Do you usually think of sugar? I would say a lot of people do not think of sugar, right? They would probably think of a hamburger, something, fats, right? Greasy foods. But not a lot of people would call out sugar as being something that increases your cholesterol and triglycerides. So sugar, it's very interesting when we talk about sugar. When you have these inflammatory markers, which are, so if you're looking at inflammatory markers in your body when you're doing labs, you know, you would look into the cholesterol and how you're doing with triglycerides, right? And these may indicate that you have excess inflammation happening somewhere in your body, right? So sugar, this is what happens. It increases those, and then also increases your platelet aggregation. What that means is, so platelets is what makes the blood stick together, right? So if your blood becomes too sticky, then it definitely increases your risk of a heart attack, of a stroke, and you don't want that, right? You don't want increased platelet aggregation, which is what causes, which sugar causes this. It also slows down the white blood cells. And what are white blood cells? What do they help us with? They protect us from bacteria and viruses, right? So we don't want those to slow down. We want those to be functioning very well. So they did this study in rats, as most of the studies, and they increased their sugar intake by 10%. And then what happened? What were the results? There was a 10% decrease in the vitamin absorption, the minerals and the proteins they were absorbing in their bodies, a 50% decrease in overall antibody production. And what's most interesting is when they increased the sugar diet by 75%, almost altogether decreased the antibody production. And they've noticed and looked at it in humans as well. And this is very similar results that you get. So sugar, we're going to start out with sugar as being one of the major players in inflammatory foods that cause inflammation. So let's continue on with white blood cells and sugar. So there was a study, another study done by dentists in Loma Linda University. And these measured the amount of bacteria that the white blood cells could inactivate in a period of about an hour. Okay, so these are their findings. They saw that the immune system decreased, so the functioning of the immune system. They also saw that, for example, they give an example of what they did in this study. 100 grams of sugar, so imagine 2 pieces of chocolate cake, decreased how the white cells were fighting off the bacteria. And then even more interesting, 1 candy bar and a soft drink together, they dropped by 90% of how the white blood cells were functioning, which is very interesting, right? 90% to 50%. So, so we see how this kind of just shows, you know, the white blood cells, you are more prone if you're having more sugar intake, how this starts kind of sluggish white blood cells and the slower the functioning that your immune system has to respond to any infections, and you're more prone to, you know, getting all those different types of cold and propensity for all of those things. So here's a list of what they found in a nurses' health study. So they did this study for thousands of nurses. And they were trying to see with these nurses, what were some inflammatory markers associated with certain foods. So what they found is that the higher inflammatory markers were found in, what do you think, out of these? Soft Coke and soft drinks, sugary drinks, refined grains like white, and just think of white, right? White bread, white rice, white pasta. That's why you don't want to have those in your pantry. Those are the most inflammatory foods that increase your inflammatory markers. And then they saw that, oh, and then I missed the bottom one, the processed meats. When we talk about processed meats, we talk about like hot dogs and what you put in your sandwiches, those cold meats, right? And sausages. And the lower inflammatory markers were associated with cruciferous vegetables and colored vegetables, as you see there. The cruciferous are the ones that are like broccoli, cauliflower, cabbage, and all those colored over there, as we've talked about how beneficial the bell peppers and carrots are, and all of those other vegetables. So that's what they found, right? The interesting thing as well is they even found that those nurses that were drinking those Diet Cokes, right? They think they're going on the safer side, Diet Coke, and let me not use white sugar, let me put Splenda, and other sweeteners, artificial sweeteners, right? They found that those were amongst the most inflammatory foods as well. So that was their finding. And what's happening now with substitutes, when we talk about artificial sweeteners and different substitutes, we might be thinking that we're substituting something that is harmful for something that is less harmful. But they're finding a lot that as you substitute, these are almost, if not the same, a little bit more harmful, which is very surprising, I would say, for a lot of us. And I can explain a little bit more in some of the other slides that we'll talk about. But what happens with these artificial sweeteners and substitutes? So since these are not natural occurring, what happens is that you don't end up feeling satisfied after you eat these things. So what do you tend to do? You tend to eat a little bit more, right? You tend to want more. And these are kind of like empty calories too. You're just getting kind of things that are not really, you know, you're not getting the nutrient benefits. But if we see here in this passage, it's interesting that the Bible talks about spending in those things that are not bread and don't satisfy. In Isaiah 55:2, we see, wherefore do ye spend money for that which is not bread, and your labor for that which satisfied not? Hearken, which means listen diligently unto me, and eat ye that which is good, and let your soul delight itself in fatness. Fatness means joyfulness in that, in a different context, no, in a different kind of version to it. So not only, they're finding that not only these artificial sweeteners and substitutes impact the neuroendocrine, but the inflammation occurs in all of these, as I mentioned. So what are some of the dietary causes of inflammation? Let's look at some of the foods that we see in here. What do you think that all of these foods have in common? Just kind of by looking at them. Processed, okay, yeah, that's right. All of these are processed. Anything else that comes to mind when you see alcohol, like coffee, some of these, you know, candy there? Anything else comes to mind? Yeah, all of those are correct, but does the word maybe addictive come to mind? These do tend to be very addictive, right? So we have here, like you mentioned, alcohol, GMO. We're going to talk about MSG and what that stands for and why that's important to know about. Yeast and yes, processed foods. We see the pastas, the refined foods. We see things that are in plastics, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in one of the lectures on toxicity and toxins, right, and plastics. But yeah, sugars and caffeine and all of those different things. So flavor enhancers, like we said, and foods that you're overall might be sensitive to. There's a reason why there's a lot of food sensitivities, right? And chemicals. So another dietary cause of inflammation can be eating too frequently or too much, right, in between meals, which we've mentioned before, and fats, right, trans, saturated, oxidated. What we mean by oxidated fats, we would be referring to oils. And we'll talk just a little bit more about that. So this is not a comprehensive list, but these are just the major layers of inflammation, if you wanted to get a good picture of those, kind of a mental picture. So we usually don't think, like I was mentioning, about food when we think about addictive things, but it's nevertheless addictive, such as thinking of drugs, right? How addictive. They actually have done a study and they found that sugar is definitely a more addictive at times than, what was it, cocaine, I think they said, when they've done different studies on them, because there's something just in sugar, right, that sometimes we just cannot give up. So so inflammatory foods tend to be addictive, right, when we see these type of foods in there. And these all contribute to autoimmune diseases, leaky gut, and they can directly impact the epithelial lining, which we've said that we want to protect that barrier, and that we want to keep safe. So MSG. So has anyone heard of MSG? Or is this the first time you're hearing about it? Just to have an idea. MSG flavoring? No? Okay. So, some of you, I do see some of you have heard about it. Okay, so MSG. So MSG is a flavor enhancer, and that is a glutamate. That is, let me see here. I think I misplaced my note over here. Okay, so it's an excitatory neurotransmitter of the central nervous system. But when you have excessive amounts of MSG, it can be neurotoxic. It can even kill some of the cells. So MSG was actually started up in Japan in the early 1900s. And you'll see these MSG flavor almost in a lot of processed foods. Mostly you'll see it in Chinese restaurants and Chinese foods like soy and even amino acids and nutritional yeast and things like that that a lot of us vegans tend to like. But it's actually, they've done a lot of different studies on the effects that it does. So they found that MSG could be cost benefit effective. So by reducing the need of actual food, they could include this artificial flavor, right? But it does have a physiological effect. It constrains the blood vessels, which lowers the blood flow in the body. And again, it may work at the neuroendocrine level, and has been associated with incident of obesity in Chinese population because they use it the most, but unfortunately it has come to the US with a lot of products, like I mentioned. And what do you think it causes more an increase of obesity? Because like we said, right, with all these artificial enhancers, you tend to not have that feeling of, you're satisfied. You just tend to want more and keep on going. And there's a whole, we can look at how the brain functions. There is a whole science behind of how MSG actually works in the brain, so that doesn't give you that like break to stop eating. So they did a study in rats, right? And they found that very high doses of this, damaged the hypothalamus, and it also damaged their eyesight. And they had different chronic effects: obesity, reproductive issues, stunted growth. They've done so many studies on these, and so many people have tried to get it off the market, put it, talk to FDA about it. But as we'll see in a couple of slides, it hasn't stopped. And because they find that it's very cost effective, right? And you'll find a lot of mixed studies out there kind of supporting MSG and then others opposing it. But let's look at what this slide tells us. So the FDA concludes that MSG is safe when eaten at customary levels. Okay, so what the scientists were saying, that this presupposes, whoever was doing these studies and did this statement, they presuppose that every person that is consuming MSG has an intact blood-brain barrier. And we've talked about it in other presentations. The blood-brain barrier, you want to keep it intact. You don't want anything to permeate that, right? And what are some things that can weaken your blood-brain barrier? So let's look at this list briefly. So if you have any sort of inflammation, that affects your blood-brain barrier. Chronic disease, especially Alzheimer's. If you have any metal toxicity, so if you're around metals that are toxic to your body. If you have a diet high in fat, if you have diet high in excited toxins, if you have diets high in salt, right? And infants and children that is not fully developed. So if you have any of these, which I'm sure most of us have at least one or a couple of these, then we don't have an intact blood-brain barrier, right? So then if you're adding MSG with the foods that you're eating, then of course that does definitely impact your health in other ways. And there's a whole study that we could go deep on, but we're not going to go that deep today. But let's talk about other flavor enhancers. So what do you see in that? I don't know if you can see it very clearly, but those are chips, right? And they're getting mixed in there with these flavor enhancers, and that's why they're so good, right? We really enjoy chips. But these include glutamate textured protein. So these are other flavor enhancers that MSG goes under, which is very tricky, right? And sneaky because they don't necessarily say MSG, contains MSG, right? Because I think it has become such a high topic that a lot of people don't want MSG in their food. So these are other names that you can find. And you can just kind of see yeast extract, calcium, sodium, caseinate, aspartame, natural flavors or other natural flavors. sometimes when you see natural flavors, there's a red flag in there, right? They're not really telling you what, it's not natural. That's all I can say. But they're just putting it there, some natural flavors in there. They're not really naming what it is. But that's usually how a lot of the food gets processed. If you see, all of these companies are very interested, right? And you buying your product once again. So they definitely want you to come back for more, right? Just like a Coke and other things. So they do get all of these things mixed up in there to enhance and make you enjoy the product. So let's talk a little bit about LPS, right? So LPS is lipopolysaccharide, and you don't necessarily have to remember that, but LPS is a major component of the cell wall of gram-negative bacteria. I'll talk a little bit more about that, but it contributes greatly to the structure and integrity of the bacteria, and it protects the membrane from certain kinds of chemical attack. So this is a good bacteria you do need. And then you do find, but you don't want a lot of it, okay? So sources of high LPS would be these type of foods over here. So let's go over what these are. Animal products, meat and pork, poultry, right? Bone broth, and chocolate, and fermented food. You can see some of the jars in there, some fermented food that has a lot of bacteria buildup over there. And the thing about LPS is that it's very heat resistant. So you cannot just cook it up. It's heat resistant. So it's a potent toxin. If it gets into the system, it will cause disease. So I think it was a little bit confusing a moment ago when I said that we do have it, right? So let me go back to that. So I was mentioning actually that there's a bacteria that protects you from getting LPS. So I'm sorry if that was confusing. So we don't want LPS actually in our body. So we do have a cell wall that protects us from chemical attacks. And LPS seems to permeate in there. And these are high foods that have LPS. So let me just reword that. Is your word? Yes, that's a source of dairy. So any dairy products, any animal products, and other things that you might see in there. Chocolate. I don't know if you're too familiar with how chocolate is made, but it's very interesting. And a lot of these things we could just go on and on talking about it, but we're just talking kind of in the surface right now. So LPS and inflammation. Low levels, like that's what I was referring to. Low levels are naturally occurring in the gut because as you might remember, we do have good and bad bacteria in our gut. There has to be a good balance. And if there is a dysbiosis, that means a bad imbalance, that you have a lot of bad bacteria in your gut, then that creates leaky gut, and then that creates inflammation and all sorts of diseases, right? So it's associated with systemic inflammation when it gets into the blood and you get a leaky gut. And it can cause liver damage. And then these other conditions over here: obesity, type 2 diabetes, cognitive impairment, cardiovascular disease, can cause fever in some people, chronic gut inflation. All right. So when we have increased LPS absorption, we get a leaky gut, and they did this other study in mice, and they were giving them a diet of high-fat diet, saturated, emulsified foods, and they saw that it elevated LPS concentration, and then all the other things that we mentioned that it causes, right? The accumulation in the liver, the inflammatory markers, and interacting with the immune system, decreasing the functionality of it. So another verse that's interesting that we find in the Bible is that it does give instructions on eating meat and fat, right? We see in the book of Leviticus 7:23, it says, Leviticus is a book that talks a lot about like what is meant to be eaten and to avoid and to prevent disease. So it says, speak to the children of Israel saying, you shall not eat any fat of ox or sheep or goat. So it's interesting that it already talked about it back then. So let's briefly talk about what is AGE. This is advanced glycation end products. When you heat up fats and proteins, when you heat them up, they get glycated. So what does that mean? So you know, when you have hemoglobin A1C in those like yearly physicals, you look at your hemoglobin A1C, right? So that's a measure of how many red blood cells have been sugared, right? So the reason the sugar molecules attaches to the red blood cells is that means that your sugar levels are pretty high, right? So the proteins or fats in food that become glycated is related to the exposure that you've had of sugar. So some of the sources of AGE, the advanced glycation end products, are animal foods high in fat and protein, and they can further be affected by cooking. I'll show you a little example over here. So if you have beef and you want to fry it, you increase the AGE. So you see there 9,522 AGEs. If you have beef, the same beef, but you instead of frying it, you just make it into a stew, you have about, let's see, 7,000 less AGs, right? So do you see kind of the difference? It's a major difference. You see in there. Chicken, when you roast it, you have 5,975. When you boil it, you have 2,232. And then you can go down the list. Beef, broiled, as opposed to boiled, lamb broiled, as opposed to boiled. The potatoes, when you have French fried potatoes, 694 as opposed to just boiling a potato, 17 AGs, which is very interesting, right? How that can really go up as you heat up.
What does poached mean?
Poached? I don't know, I've never poached anything. Just water?
Yeah, like you cook it only in water, like instead of any oil or anything. You just cook it.
Oh, instead of the oil, you put water just to kind of,
Yeah, like small amounts of water so
cook it.
that it's able to cook.
okay, poaching it. Interesting. So GMO, right? I've gotten a lot of questions of why it's so important to have organic foods. And I feel the more you look into documentaries and just information and research and studies and the science behind what happens with the GMO world out there, then you tend to become more convinced. But that's definitely a choice and then the individual kind of walk of life that you're at. But it is important to understand kind of, what happens. And let me just say that there were a lot more slides on here that I just reduced by like maybe 8, because it talks a lot about like toxins of GMO, and there's a whole lecture on that I'll probably include those later on. But just so that you get an overview, there are some Roundup Ready plants that have been modified so that despite of being sprayed with the main component of the pesticide is called glyphosate, the plant can survive. So imagine of having Roundup Ready. Roundup is a pesticide, right? But it's a very strong chemical. So imagine having these plants that can be sprayed so much at higher levels of glyphosate, which is a very harmful chemical, so that the plant can still survive even though it's being sprayed many, many times at higher levels with this chemical. And these are plants that we're consuming, right? So Roundup Ready plants absorb glyphosate at higher levels, and it impacts nutritional availability to those consuming food. And of course, it brings out other health effects. So what are some major GMO crops? We cannot mention all of them, right? Unfortunately, our world today is big on GMO. It's so hard to find things that are not GMO. Unless you're constantly looking for organic, right? But almost everything is. What are the major crops? Major crops here, I don't know if you can tell, but that's an alfalfa plant over there. Soy and corn are 90% GMO in the US. So if you're looking at the highest of the highest of GMO is soy and corn. And that's very unfortunate, I would say, for a lot of us that have stopped eating meat, because soy was our go-to food, right? I mean, it can still be, I'm not saying to completely eliminate it, but I'm just saying it's so hard to find nice non-GMO soy nowadays. And that's why you might find a lot of people very sensitive to soy. I don't know if you've heard, there's just a lot of people that have like soy sensitivities nowadays. And that might be because of the glyphosate in it. So for the crops, cotton as well, canola, papaya, and animal derivatives that you find GMOs, meat, eggs, milk products, like fish and gelatin. So those are some of the major ones.
Why are papayas and beets on there?
Because those are the major, these are the highest kind of on the GMO crops list. That's why those are included in there. Yes. On the highest, that means the highest percentage, they're most likely. Other GMO foods, so these are not like, these are things that you'll find in the ingredients, right, that are already processed. What do you see in here? Cooking oils, right? We talked about canola and soybean, but we already know that we have canola oil and soybean oil and all these things, margarine, baked goods, your processed cereal, Coke and pastries and sodas, right? So these are things that are already processed, but they have these things in them. So what are the foods that are high in glyphosate? So let's see over here, what do you kind of see in there? Chickpeas and lentils. So as I'm mentioning these are just to kind of be in the lookout. These are the major foods. If you cannot get all organic, right? Like a lot of us cannot get every single thing organic, but these are the ones that you probably want to place your focus on and do get organic. These are chickpeas and lentils, oatmeal, pea products, like I said, soy, beans, millet, veggies, fruits, nuts, and grains.
Nuts, how are nuts on there?
They're on the high glyphosate food. So I mean that they have high levels of glyphosate.
What is glyphosate?
This is the chemical that's sprayed with kind of the pesticides and on these crops.
So you can't get nuts without glyphosate?
I mean, these are just to be on the lookout. If you are able to get organic, it's just recommended that you do, if you're able to.
So organic ones would not have the glyphosate.
Yes, and there is things that, you know, we're looking very deeply and profoundly on these. There's cross-pollination sometimes with the crops. You know, there are some crops that you have GMO crops, and then right over here you have the organic crops, and there's the cross-pollination. But then, yeah, if you try to get these, then if you get the organic, they should have, if not any, less of the glyphosate because of the cross-pollination that happens naturally by having crops one next to another. And it gets really complicated. Sometimes we can feel a little bit like hopeless, right? Like, oh, what world are we living in? But it's sad. But if you look more deep into this, we'll talk about it at the end. All right, so in 2012, they rose the tolerance levels of glyphosate, unfortunately, in the US. They saw that, you know, they could get away with like raising the levels of glyphosate in different types of food. So ppm stands for parts per million. So they raised these on these foods, cereals, animal feed, so the animal husbandry. And these animals are feeding off, and then, you know, some people are eating the animal products, right? The soybean, they increased, as you see in there, 120. That was the highest one that was increased the tolerance level of glyphosate residues, and everything else in between. So the conclusion here, as we conclude this night. So the 3 R's, right? Remove, replace, and repair. So we're trying to remove all those harmful inflammatory foods that we might have learned about this night, and triggers and inflammatory triggers, like I said, and replace it with helpful benefits and habits, right? And that way we can repair our system. And we also talked about inflammatory foods. They tend to be addictive. There's a whole brain science behind that, that the companies are very well aware of. They actually do contract a lot of psychologists and scientists to kind of help them with their products. And toxins are potent inflammation drivers. Food is a significant source of toxins nowadays, unfortunately, and we try to eat to avoid toxins and to heal our gut and our digestive system, right? So in the book of Joel, there is another interesting parts that we see in these 3 verses. I just wanted to share with you. Even back then, right? We see Joel talking about the field is wasted, the land mourneth, or the corn is wasted, the new wine is dried up, the oil languisheth, and the wheat and for the barley, because the harvest of the field is perished, the seed is rotten under their plots. So we see all of that. And that can kind of get us in a gloomy mood, and but there's always hope, right? In Jeremiah 30:17, it says, "But I will restore you to health and heal your wounds, declares the Lord." So there is hope, and we are trying to find what best things we can do to be at optimal health. And that's why it's important to understand all of these things, just the backdrop of it. Because like we said in the first lecture, when we start taking accountability as to what we're consuming and what we're doing, we're more able to fight off, different. Yep. One more. This one? Okay, sure. Yes, and so we go back always, right, to wholeness, right? That puts us in more alignment in how our bodies are designed and function better, right? And as we remember here, wholeness, we're talking about water and good habits and oxygen and love and good relationships, right? Restoring those, environment, nutrition, exercise, sunlight, and sleep. And we're going to start all of those in the next lectures. So what is next? We have our super healing foods that we're going to talk about next week. And this is definitely one that you don't want to miss if you're looking at what can heal. So now we went over, if you remember all the past lectures, have been like, this is food that you want to avoid, prevent from eating, all those things that are going to cause you inflammation. So now we're going to go over the next side of things, which is super healing foods. We're going to talk about garlic and onion and other things, quercetin, like I was talking about downstairs, antioxidants. What are healing foods that we can consume that will make our bodies and our health even better? And with that, I'm wondering if there's anyone still interested in getting a book that talks about the 3 R's, and it actually talks about soaking and sprouting in more depth. Yes. Okay, I saw a hand over there. Okay, so without looking at your notes, can you tell me the 3 R's? Just as you remember it, they don't have to be perfect. You guys want to help her? Okay, that's allowed. Replace. Repair.
Remove, replace, repair. Together.
Right. Let's give it to her. Yeah, she was quick to raise her hand. All right, so we'll send it over there that way, and you're welcome. And I just wanted to get a little bit of your feedback, because I know some of these lectures get very technical with a lot of terms and science and anatomy and physiology aspects. I just want to get your input as I'm doing these slides. Maybe I'll get a little bit off like I did today, not talking so much about the technical things and eliminating some of those slides so we can get to the more practical. Just kind of by your feedback, what do you think about that? Or has it been useful for you to understand kind of the anatomy behind it? You know, how those neurotransmitters work in your brain, all of that.
Are we gonna learn about allergen?
I know that has been one of your major questions, and well, let's see, with the super healing foods, I'll make it a point to talk about collagen producing foods. So with that can be an answer of being more practical in that, right? Any other thoughts before we end tonight?
Need a little bit of both.
Yeah, a good balance, right?
But, like today, the inflammation things, I was thinking you were gonna give us more in depth of what's the inflammation stuff than the science. I guess I was expecting more, here's the foods to kind of avoid and stuff. And I think there was, it was more general than I was expecting, I guess.
Okay, that was more general. Would that be an aspect, like, when they mentioned like animal products and sugar and things like that, did you kind of want to see specific
I
examples of
guess I was
those?
expecting more of the identifying the actual food, not the category. of
General
food.
category, okay, got it.
But that's just my thought coming
Yeah.
in, not realizing what we're gonna get.
Yeah, that's good feedback, thank you. Okay, all right, okay, good. All right, well, yeah, I'll keep that in mind as you see, I am following kind of the way these lectures are made, and that's why I wanted to get feedback, because not all demographics and groups are the same, right? When we're talking about these topics, so just wanted to get your feedback since you're the one that's getting the benefit, yeah.
Can I ask where the whole set of lectures come from? Is it
These,
from the guys who created the book, or is this something?
yes, from these two doctors, and so one of them does have a health natural center, as I've mentioned before, and they work with very sick patients. Mostly, they started off this journey with autoimmune diseases, but if you can, if you notice, if you target autoimmune, you can target anything else, because autoimmune is just a very complicated condition to kind of reverse and
Well,
restore.
who was the original, I mean, they're the ones doing it, what was the target audience back then? Because some of this is very, like you said, very technical, and if you don't understand the science of it, you really
Right.
just sit here writing words.
Their target, well, I think they did have a lot of doctors and kind of medical, group over there, yeah. They are from California, kind of the Loma Linda, very big health system, so
What's the name of their health center?
restored or years restored in
Years
California.
Restored.
Yeah. All right, well, thank you so much for joining us today, and hope to see you next week. Right?